In this episode of My Words, My Book, we have Louie Stowell. Louie writes books about magic, gods and monsters mostly. She has written books about space, politics and science, but eventually lapsed into just making stuff up. The award-winning Loki, a Bad God's Guide series, is her first as both author and illustrator, inspired by her research into Norse myths. Louie,
Oh.
why did you become an author?
So this is a really hard question because I have a terrible memory. So I was thinking of this on the way over. And do you want the honest answer?
Yes, please.
So I tried a lot of jobs.
Which is good.
And so there was an element of experimentation in deciding to become an author. But I think it was sort of wanting a job that wasn't a job. So doing something creative that didn't feel like it had too much structure. So being an author, I feel like every day is different. You're very much obviously making things up, but the idea is, I suppose, your world is what you make of it. Your world is inside your head, but it's also getting what's in your head out there. So I suppose there's an element of having something to say, but also just liking the sound of my own voice a bit, maybe.
Fantastic. And I'm really curious to know what your other jobs were, Louie.
So I've never made a full list, but there was definitely cartoonist, waitress, worked in a shop. Then I worked in PR, which is, if you know me, that's not me at all, but it was one of those, I needed a job, applied for a job, there was the job, and it was in the early 2000s, so very different world. But then I worked in advertising and then in publishing, so behind the scenes, making the books rather than writing them. So yeah, so it was only a couple of years ago that I went full-time as an author.
Which is amazing. And I think to add there your role as a publisher, you were my editor.
Yes, I was.
Of My Skin, Your Skin, Louie, which is interesting. And when I go into schools or I'm doing events, museums, storytelling, and a question comes up about the writing process, how long does it take to write a book, who's involved? And I say, oh, editor. So children, this is the editor.
Yeah.
And how I describe the role as an editor may be interesting to get your take on this. I say, well, okay, I write the book as the first draft. I email it to the editor, Louie, for My Skin, Your Skin. And then Louie will come back with some wonderful notes and to say, okay, we need to move this sentence to that page, or we need to add a bit more on this. Maybe we could take this out. This is interesting. What are you thinking about this? And then I get that back, children, and then I make those edits. I think about it and I say, yes, Louie was absolutely correct. And when
I like to hear.
And then the point that I finish on with regards to that, I always say, but I'm not upset. And guess what, children? When your teachers or your grown-up give you back some work and they want you to do more, it's because they want you to do your best. So the editor, Louie, wanted my book, My Skin, Your Skin, to be the best book. And so that's the role of the editor. So you must never be upset with your teacher. You're grown up, if it's a parent or somebody else, when they give you back your work to do more, it's because they want you to do your best. So I always say an editor is like a teacher or a parent. There we are.
Yeah, don't give you pocket money.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
absolutely.
So that's so interesting to see it from your point of view. Because I think, well, obviously now I see it from the other side. I see it from the writer's side. And I have to confess, sometimes I do get upset. And a friend of mine gave me a great idea for this, which would probably work for children writing stories as well. If you're feeling upset with your editor or teacher or parent, you go and sit in the huff tree. Because you're in a huff and you climb up the huff tree and you sit there and you go, and then you sort of sit with the suggestion for a while. And then you realise they're probably right. And then you
Yeah.
climb back down from the huff tree. And sometimes you do argue, and that's fine too. You know, sometimes you're like, well, actually, I
The
said it because
healthy
of this.
argument.
Yeah, and it's like, or what you do is you say, well, I was trying to say this. And they're like, oh, brilliant, say that. Because sometimes as an editor, I might give a suggestion that isn't right. But quite often what I'm trying to do is prompt someone to come
Yeah.
up with something that is, you know.
And I think equally on that point, it's, yes, sometimes I have gone back and I've said, okay, then there's a reason why, and it's really helpful for the editor to know why you've included
Yeah.
that particular word or that particular sentence.
Yeah, because
you know?
sometimes it just needs one additional word to give it context or some little extra, even sometimes an image. So it's more about, well, we're going to put this in the picture and that'll make sense of this word, you know.
Exactly. No, thank you for that. And what was your favourite children's book that you read?
This was such a hard question. I don't have all the books I had as a child. Some of them are in a box at my mum's house, but I do have one very precious one. So I used to read a comic called Oink. It was in the 1980s, 1990s, and it was sort of a parody of the Beano. So yeah, I read the Beano, and this had lots of things that made fun of the Beano or the Dandy. So there was a character called Desperate Dan in the Dandy, and this is an old man version of Desperate Dan. And there was a character who made no sense to me as a child, but I also loved, called Frank Sidebottom. It's just a man with a very round head. And what I loved about this comic was it is very naughty. It's got a character in it who's a censor, as in someone that tells you what you can't say. She's called Mary Lighthouse. And she basically goes around telling all the characters not to say rude jokes and not to say bottoms and things. And that just really tickled me as a child, because it's that idea of the forbidden, which makes you obviously want to read it more. So I always think when everyone, you know, if you really want to make someone read something, tell them not to do it, you know, tell them it's bad.
That's very interesting, because I think maybe that book has influenced your writing now.
Absolutely, yeah. It's very much a part of me, and I'm always tend to kind of bring it up when I'm talking about influences, because it's a very anarchic set. It's not a single story, it's a set of stories. And I love that idea of a story that could go anywhere, and also a story that assumes you've read lots of other stories and then plays with it, you know. So it's not like this is the first story someone's ever read, which is probably what I'm not an ideal picture book writer. I've written a picture book, but I feel like I'm always going to want to play with a story. So I couldn't do a very young picture book. I can do one for like 5-year-olds, because then they know some classic stories and you can start messing with them a bit.
Exactly, and you can see that. Are there any other books that you would want to add?
Yeah, so I get sent a lot of books by
Yes,
publishers
yeah.
and things. And out of the massive pile, this is one of my favourite recent ones, called Guardians of the New Moon. And it's about the Chinese zodiac and how it came to be. So it's like a retelling of that myth, but in a very contemporary context. So the girl who's also a firefox is you know, a modern girl, and it's got a grumpy cat. Who doesn't love a grumpy cat? And it's a very kind of like funny and exciting story. I think sometimes, you know, I get sent a lot of books that kind of like very important, very meaningful books that are very kind of like big messages and stuff. This is just a really fun story, and it's just, you know, like it's about a race, you know. And I think there's something about that, and about the way it's written. Eric Huang, who wrote it, he's got a very kind of light touch.
Yes.
So he really kind of makes the story pace along, but also deals with mythology in funny ways. So it starts off with the Jade Emperor who created the universe, I think. Yeah, universe. Starts off with him having his breakfast, and then he's bored and doesn't know what to do. So he invents the zodiac. So, you know, it's kind of making those mythical characters relatable, which is obviously something I'm a big fan of.
Exactly, and I think what's important about what you just shared, that even us as adults, we love reading children's books.
Yeah.
Children's books, I say, are for everybody, young adult books as well. I enjoy reading them. Likewise yourself, and being authors, we get sent so many books, which I
Yeah.
absolutely adore. I donate the books once I've finished with them. Amazing.
Well, this one is staying with me because my niece and nephew really like it. So my wife reads it to them over Zoom.
Oh, that's wonderful, isn't it? Yeah.
Yeah.
And that's another thing that's important, bringing in technology, is that children enjoy books as well in
Yeah.
person and in Zoom because,
Yeah. Well, because when you can actually, I think FaceTime, whatever thing it is, but basically when it's like a graphic novel, then what my wife will do, we'll put the camera on it so you can't see her, but she's reading it sort of, and then
Amazing.
the child's looking at the pictures, because it's very hard to read a comic just out loud because obviously the
Yes,
pictures are an integral part. But I mean, same for a picture book, you know, you really need to
indeed.
show the images at the same
Yes,
time.
yeah. No, that's good. Fantastic. I love that. And then on to this. Du, du, du. Loki, a bad god's guide to making enemies. And what I love about this is that you've written and illustrated the book yourself. And how did that come about? Just to ask that as a question. Did you always have in mind when you first started to write this series that you were going to be the illustrator as well?
I wanted to be, but I didn't think it was going to happen. So
Okay.
I did a lot of doodles while I was writing it. But my agent said, don't expect to be able to actually, you know, draw it. Because, you know, I'm not a professional illustrator. Most publishers will want, you know, to choose their own illustrator and pair you together. But it went out on submission, so, you know, sharing with all the publishers. And one of the publishers that came back wanting it said, well, why don't you do the pictures? And that actually was connected to my past as an editor, because I'd been an editor alongside my now editor, and it wasn't anything to do with my job, but I'd done some doodles on a like post-it note or something, and they'd seen them, so that's where they knew my work from. So it was kind of a weird coincidence.
Yes, yeah.
But now I can't really imagine the books with someone else doing them.
Absolutely. And it works quite well, doesn't it? When I see a cover, in terms of, I know automatically it just jumps out to you, it's a Loki book.
And it means when I do events, then there's lots of drawing I can do with the children, because they'll look exactly, like, they'll be quite amazed that my pictures look like the ones in the books.
Yes,
like, yeah,
yes.
I drew them.
This is me.
Yeah.
So what would you, in terms of a quick summary?
Okay, so it's the fourth book in the series, but the idea is you can kind of read them in any order. So Loki is the Norse god of mischief, and he's come down to Earth in the form of a child. And this is a punishment because he did some mischief in Asgard, where the gods live. He's been down for a few months now. And from time to time, people tend to turn up from his past because he's wronged them, because he's wronged a lot of people. So this time, an elf comes, an elf called Vanir, who Loki insulted at a feast. Feasts are a very big part of Asgardian culture, you know. So, and Loki's insulted so many people, he doesn't even remember the guy. So it's about this elf challenging Loki to a duel, a magical duel. And now Loki can use a magic wand a bit, but he hates practicing, so he's not that good, whereas the elf has been practicing for thousands of years. And sort of against that backdrop, Loki also has to make up to his friend. So his friend Georgina, he's upset her because he got her into trouble. She's quite a good girl, and he got her detention because he set fire to the school. It wasn't her fault, but anyway, so he's spending the book trying to make back friends with Georgina while also trying not to die in a duel with Vanir. So you could also call the book a Bad God's Guide to Making Friends, but enemies sounds more fun.
Yes, exactly. Absolutely, absolutely. And from that, this is the fourth book. You're currently working on book 5?
Yeah.
Wow.
So I've got the whole thing planned out for 9 books or so. But so I'm sort of, I suppose I'm halfway through now.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes, yeah.
So it's sort of...
Any spoilers for book 5? Or?
Yeah, okay.
Why not?
The goddess Freya will be coming.
Okay.
And you get a clue of that when you see the cover, because it has giant cats on it. And the goddess Freya is the goddess of love and war, and her chariot is pulled by giant cats, which I always thought was very brave of her, because cats never really do what you're told, what you tell them to do. So yeah, just picture them going all over the place before she gets anywhere.
So it sounds, if there's 9 books in the series, you're always writing a
Yeah.
Loki book then.
Always on to the next.
So how many more years would that be? Is that another 3-4
I
years?
think, yeah. So book 5 comes out in 2025, so book 9 would be in 2029. So almost a new decade.
Decade.
Yeah.
Decade of Loki. Wow,
Yeah.
amazing. Have to have a big celebration.
We should actually, yeah.
After the ninth, final one, but we'll probably squeeze in a book 10.
Yeah, why not?
We'll see. Why not?
to?
Why not? So saying that, what is your favourite page in this book? Or
My
do you
time.
have one?
I
Of
do.
course,
So,
absolutely.
I said I'm free with spoilers, but I don't want to give anything too much away about this specific book. Because I figure if I say something about book 5, people will forget by the time they read it. But I will show something from relatively early on. So this is Veneer the elf. I gave him a very elaborate costume, loosely based on David Bowie's costume in Labyrinth, but with a long cloak with skulls on and pointy boots. And I realised in most of the book he's turned into a child. So I gave him the elaborate costume as an adult, and then a child he's just wearing t-shirt and shorts. So I only have to draw this a couple of times, and then it's the easy version for the rest of the book. But I just wanted to give him a really dramatic outfit because
Loving the boots.
he has a big, yeah. Elves are very, very full of drama, very full of themselves. So yeah, that's my favourite.
Yes, yeah.
Of ones that don't.
And all the illustrations. It's just it's a fun book for me. It's quite a laugh out loud. All of the books in the series. And when I ever go into schools and asking children about their books, your book comes up quite a lot now, which is good. There are other books which they always say, and even for World Book Day, we know the ones that children are going to be dressing up.
Yeah.
So it's really refreshing to see new books coming through that children are talking about when I'm having conversations with them.
I mean, I love asking children what they're reading at that moment and what they're into, and sometimes it's really surprising things. Like sometimes it's something really old, like
that's right, yeah.
Like someone was mentioning the Ruby Redford mysteries, which are about a decade old now, but yeah, 10-year-olds are finding them.
Exactly, and I think that's the beauty of books, is that they're evergreen, so to speak. That sometimes certain books can come back in vogue, and then children start reading them again. And I think it's great for that author and illustrator, if there was an illustrator for a particular book.
Yeah,
it's just a really good way, and I think to celebrate reading. And I think for one of the messages that I always give children, as long as you read, it could be a fiction book or a non-fiction book, reading is super important.
It is, yeah. Actually, I nearly brought a non-fiction book along as well. So, because I always loved those books of myths when I was a kid. And calling that non-fiction sounds funny because it's a myth, but it's a kind of non-fictional approach to myth of like, this is what that god was called by the Vikings, and who were the Vikings?
Yes.
And, sort of digging into all of that.
And I can see everything that you're talking about in this interview. The influences from the books that you read as a child all coming through, those mysteries, those wanting to find out more type books, And if you was interviewing yourself, what question would you ask yourself about this book?
If I was me and interviewing myself, I'd ask, tell me more about Norse elves. Because I love elves. I grew up with Tolkien. I didn't bring Lord of the Rings because it's not a children's book. It was actually a book I read as a child. So when I read Lord of the Rings as a kid, I just assumed Tolkien had made elves up. What I didn't realise is they come from many cultures, but one of those cultures is Norse. So the elves in Norse mythology are... Well, there's not many of them actually, but they sort of turn up at feasts, and then there's one named elf called Volund who is... So he's a bit like Daedalus, who made the maze in Greek mythology, except he's an elf. So he's a maker. He kind of creates machines or jewelry, all kinds of strange things. Oh, and I was thinking of it. I thought, that'd make a great father figure. So that's the father of my elf in the book.
I see.
But yes, I think as a reader, I would be very interested in kind of, when there's a mythological figure, which version are you going with? Where are you coming from? Because when I was writing the book, I was also thinking about, I could go with slightly more contemporary Nordic concepts of elves, which are slightly more kind of hidden people who live in the hills, because there's still quite a lot of folklore in Iceland, say, around elves. But I just went old school, and the kind of slightly more goes to feasts, has fights, makes stuff, elves.
As an extension to your point there, what do you want children to take away, to learn, and to think, oh wow, this book is amazing? What are the takeaways?
So I want them to laugh, and I realise that's a momentary, it's not like a takeaway as such, but I want them to keep that feeling, you know. But I also want them to think about questions like, what does it mean to be good? What does it mean to be a friend? What does it mean to be an enemy? And I suppose the kind of, if there is a message, the message is always going to be no one is fixed. Like, you can always change. And if you want to, you know, not saying everyone has to change, but if you have something you want to change, then you're malleable. You know, you're
Exactly. And I think
you're alive, you're not stuck.
Yes, absolutely. And I think the point you made there about having discussions with children, what is bad, what is good, what do we mean about making friends, what are enemies? So it gets children to understand that actually there are some things people do that aren't right, that are bad, and there are some people that are kind. And how can we have, especially what's going on in the world now, how can we have more kindness and more tolerance and have more conversations with each other? And I think books do that. You know, whether it's a fiction book or a non-fiction book, it opens up those conversations and gets children thinking, well, actually, that's not right. That's not fair. What am I going to do about it? You know?
And also thinking about someone can make mistakes and that's not them forever. You know, so someone's, let's say another kid's been mean to you. They don't have to be mean to you forever. They might change, and they might, you know, and also I suppose you can allow them to change.
Exactly, absolutely. So it's not, you know, that child is going to be mean forever. It's about then saying to that child, having that conversation, you were mean because of my feelings are hurt now. I'm upset because of what you did. You know?
And I think with Loki as a character, he's terrible about understanding his own feelings. He's sort of always denying them and always is like, everything is fine. But the book is sort of looking at them in ways that he can't see. So often it's kind of him not really realizing what he's feeling, but there's ways that the book tells it, whether it's through an image or the diary talks back. So sometimes the diary is like, wait a minute, Loki, I think you're lying to yourself.
Hold on a minute.
Because the diary voice is the voice of Odin, and it's there to check if Loki's lying, because it's supposed to be a record of his deeds, and he's getting virtue points if he's good and loses points if he's bad. So he has to be honest. So the diary's there to keep him honest. But over time, the diary's become a bit more of a critical friend who's telling Loki when maybe he's deluding himself, when he's thinking something's fine when it's not.
Yes,
So yeah, it's funny. I think of it as, you know, a book about feelings for people who hate feelings.
Yes, absolutely. And I think it's super important that children do discuss their feelings, and it's okay if they're angry. It's okay if they're happy and sad, and they're able to vocalize that either through storytelling or writing books as well. And I, you know, likewise being authors, encouraging children to write.
Yeah. So I was reading about a child in, I think it was 12th century Russia or something, in Eastern Europe, who is called Onfim, and we have records of his doodles on a piece of wood.
Wow.
And I can't remember how old he was, about 11 maybe. But he's basically, we've got these doodles that look exactly like contemporary children's doodles. And it's about him being really cross that he has to go to school because he's going to be a hunter. So why does he have to go to school? And it's just like that child's feelings really come across, even though it was that long ago.
And that's an excellent point. It's one of the things I say if I'm doing a workshop with children. I invite them either to, in terms of their storytelling, to write, draw, or make marks because of the age, stage, and ability. And making marks is visualizing what they're thinking about, and marks have meanings. You know.
And there's that sort of like moving on from marks to doodles, where the doodles may not be anything, but
Yes,
they're expressing something.
exactly.
And
Absolutely.
often kind of like even just a scribble or something can be really, really emotive.
Exactly. And that's a really good point. So anything else that you want to share about writing, storytelling, being an author as a takeaway?
Yeah. So I think for me, one of the most surprising and joyful things about becoming an author is realizing how many other authors are out there and how we can all help each other and share ideas. And I've got lots of writer friends where, you know, some people I might be like, oh, what do you think about this passage? But others it will just be like talking about ideas or just encouraging them and just saying this book was amazing, or just discussing other books that neither of us wrote. Because I think it's sort of, having had, you know, jobs in offices before, authors are now my colleagues, and I think finding that sort of community has been really important.
Yes, yeah. And I think that's it. That's a great point to reflect on in terms of as an author, collaborating, supporting each other, and thinking about children, how they work with each other.
Yeah.
Because again, sometimes if I'm doing a workshop, I get children to work in groups or by themselves or
Yeah.
in peers, and it's amazing the stories that they come up with in their group. So I think collaboration, working together as part of a team, is important.
So I've had quite a lot of kids come up to me at events with a comic they've done with their friend. So one of them does the words, one of them does the pictures, and they're just, you know, obviously very proud of it, but it's also like part of their friendship, which is really nice.
Absolutely, yeah. And I think that's a great point to finish off on friendship.
Yeah.
Friendship is the word for this podcast. Excellent, Louie. Thank you so much for sharing all of your experience, your joys, your why in terms of why you actually write. And you can read this book, Loki, and the three others, and the books in the future that are going to come out as well. And I always say to visit your local library if you can. If you can, visit your local library because it's free. And then to finish off with, as the final point, Claudia and Tess say on Strictly Come Dancing, keep dancing. So I say, keep reading. This podcast was woven in partnership with our friends at Tapestry, the childhood education platform. They have kindly devised the educational resources for each podcast interview. Tapestry helps you celebrate children's learning, improve communication with families, and streamline your admin with powerful booking, invoicing, and management tools, giving you more time for what matters, the children and you. Visit tapestry.info to find out more. This podcast series was recorded at the Quick Brown Fox Video Production Studios in Wandsworth Town, London, with top-notch equipment and a knowledgeable team who are always happy to help. Recording our podcast has been a breeze.